All right, we're continuing on with linkage institutions, and today we're going to move into a big way that people can voice their opinions, and that is through elections and campaign. All right, so we hear a lot about nominations and the nominating process, and technically what this is an endorsement. So when we say that a political party is giving a certain individual their nomination for a particular office, then what we're saying is that we, the party, are backing them in the election. We want this person to win, and therefore we're going to allow them to have a little R or a little D next to their name, to give them more prominence and to lend our support, and also to help voters know which candidate to vote for, if you affiliate with a certain party. And for federal office, whether we're talking about the president or we're talking about House Representatives, senators, usually there's a process that involves people declaring candidacy. There are some kind of primary contest in each of the 50 states where we dwindle down the number of candidates down to one nomination. And then in a presidential election, there are national conventions, and there's lots of different parts of the puzzle. We'll go through several of them in this section and talk about the different nuances that go along with it. All right, so let's zoom in on the nomination game when it comes to selecting the President of the United States. So everything I'm going to say here mostly applies to that. So with primaries, they look a whole lot like elections, but technically they're not, because you're not selecting the actual person who will sit in the seat as a representative of the public. In reality, you're voting for delegates. So here's what happens. We have, in presidential election years, we have a big party convention that happens right before the presidential election, usually the summer before the election that takes place in November. And at that convention, you're going to have lots and lots of people, thousands of people that are members of the party who are called delegates. And delegates are going to cast their votes for a certain candidate to be the nominee. So we're in the process of dwindling down several candidates down to the one nominee who will go into the election against the one nominee from the other party. So when you're voting in a primary, you're really instructing delegates on what to do. So, and this is a state-by-state thing. So if we go to the California Republican primary and you vote for candidate X, what you are saying in basic terms is that you want all the California delegates at the national convention to vote for candidate X. Somebody else might walk in and vote for candidate Y, and they're saying, I want the delegates at the convention to vote for candidate Y. And over the course of the primary calendar, all of these results accumulate, and whoever gets the most delegates at the convention is going to wind up being the nominee. And that may be, some crazy number. You may, if you're candidate X, you may wind up with 1,295 delegates at the convention versus the second place who gets 841. So it can get really crazy. But that's basically what you're doing when you're voting in a primary. You're not voting for the candidate, you're voting for the people who will support the candidate at the convention. In the Democratic Party, when they have primaries in any given state, they usually issue delegates on a proportional basis. So this means that if you get 60% of the vote, say candidate X gets 60% of the vote in the California primary, they will walk away with 60% of the available delegates from California at the convention. If you get 30% of the vote, then you'll get 30% of the delegates from California in the convention. So it's based on a proportion of the vote that you get. In the Republican Party, they also will do proportional contest, but they also will do winner-take-all. In fact, most of the contests are winner-take-all in the second half of the primary calendar. So in this case, if you win by one vote in a particular state, say we're talking about the Minnesota Republican primary, if you win by one vote, then you get every single one of the available delegates, and there may be 60 delegates available in that contest. And so that creates some nuances when we're talking about how delegates are awarded. New Hampshire is always the first primary on the calendar, and that happens these days sometime in February. Um, but here's the thing. New Hampshire, along with Iowa, which is a caucus, we'll talk about that next, they tend to get a ton of attention. Everyone always wants to get a good start in the presidential election and try to win those first few contests. So even though New Hampshire is a small, relatively insignificant state in the presidential election, it gets tons of media attention because it's the first primary of the year. So every 4 years when we start up the presidential election process, you always hear New Hampshire, New Hampshire, New Hampshire. And a lot of people are like, why? It's just a small little tiny state. Well, it's the first one. And so because of this media attention, a lot of states are trying to move their primaries up. Because if you are at the end of the calendar, your primaries might not even really matter because we'll already know who the nominee is by the time we get to, most of the time by April or May or June, it's already decided. And so some states will want to cash in on the media attention that you can get by being in the front. So this is where we get the term front load the primaries. There are other things to consider in a primary. And we've talked about how the electorate in certain political parties, the two big ones, is really diminishing. And so we're seeing changes in the way they have rules for primaries as to who can vote. In the old days, almost all primaries for the two major parties were closed, meaning you had to be a registered party member in order to vote in the primary. And that made sense. Party members get to have a say about who the party's nominee is. But nowadays, in most recent times, we have so many independents walking around. And really we're in an age of democracy where we've seen a drop in the authority of the parties themselves, that a lot of contests have become open primaries. So now you can be a party member or an independent and vote in a primary, or you can vote in anyone you want. Depends on the state. Different states have different rules. Some states will say you can vote in either primary that you want, but you can only vote once. And then there's mixed primaries where the independents can vote, registered voters with a party must vote in their own party's primary, and there may be some other variations as well. So we're really in pretty remarkable times in American history when it comes to primaries, because the rules are changing very rapidly about who can vote in which situations in which states. Now, there's another type of nominating contest that's separate from the primaries, and it's called the caucus. So a caucus is actually the more old school way of doing things. This is how parties used to choose their nominees and much more frequently. So some states, most notably Iowa, have, instead of people going down to vote at the ballot box, they actually have town hall style meetings. And depending on where you are, the rules vary, but it can be everything from having a town hall meeting where people give speeches, and then people will move to different corners of the room in order to state who their preference is. And there's lots of different ways of doing it. The point is, you don't vote in a caucus in a formal manner with a ballot at the ballot box. You do it in a town hall meeting. And in Iowa, I talked about New Hampshire a moment ago. Iowa is even more so the contest that everybody wants to win. It's the very first contest of the whole count. It's the first caucus, and it's the first contest. And so all the candidates will park in Iowa, weeks beforehand in order to try to get that first win in the presidential election and get some momentum, which is really kind of silly because usually Iowa isn't been a very reliable indicator about who becomes the president. In other words, lots of people win Iowa who never really get any traction in the presidential election. But with that said, it's just kind of, the playbook of politicians says that they have to make a big deal about Iowa. And so that's the first caucus that gets a lot of attention. Superdelegates is another thing we should mention when it comes to the Democratic Party and how it allocates delegates. So remember, when we're talking about delegates at the convention, these are all almost entirely state party members. And remember, in the primaries and caucuses, the voters have instructed the state delegates on how to vote at the convention. The Democratic Party has not been totally willing to hand over that decision all the way to the state delegates. And so what the Democratic Party does is reserve 15% of the delegates at the convention to party leaders. And basically what this does is it allows the party elites, the people at the National Party Committee, to really kind of protect their nomination from being completely hijacked by the states. And so 15% of delegates, which is something like 700, 800 delegates at the convention out of a possible, couple of thousand, just to give the National Party a little protection against a full-fledged Democratic revolt. Now, Republicans currently reserve about 6.8% of their seats to National Committee members. They're not called superdelegates. We're more likely to call them unpledged. So there are some delegates at the Republican National Convention that can kind of make the decision on their own and not be pledged to vote in a way that the primary or caucus voters instructed them to. All right, so that's superdelegates. All right, so when we get to July, usually we have a pretty darn good understanding of who the nominees are from each party, because the primaries have already come and gone, and the voters have already instructed the vast majority of delegates, aside from those who are superdelegates or unpledged delegates. They've told them, you have to vote this way at the convention. Those are the rules of the parties. And so there begins the big drama of the party conventions that happen every 4 years right before the presidential election. And they used to be even bigger than they are now. Now what they are is a big rally, a big party, and you get all these delegates meeting in a big arena, and there's balloons, and everyone's shouting, and there's speeches, and everyone's hooting and hollering, and it's just kind of a big rally for the party going into the final stretch of the campaign. So a couple of things happen. Usually it's a 4-day event, and the first day is a keynote address, and this is usually some up-and-comer in the party that looking down the road, that's who the party wants to kind of introduce the world to and start sowing the seeds of a future leader. So, for example, Barack Obama gave the keynote address back in 2004. 4 years later, he was the president. And before that, very few people even knew who he was. JFK Jr. gave the keynote address one year, as they were setting him up to be the president someday, and then tragically he died and never got a chance. The second day is for platform defining. This is where the parties vote and define all the issues that they stand for. Very little press coverage on this every single day. So it's a really important moment. This is where the parties decide what policies they're going to pursue, and really no one ever notices. The third day is the big day, and it's the day that you'll see on TV, and that is the nomination. So remember, there's not a lot of drama here, because the delegates are going to announce who they are supporting, but it's already a foregone conclusion. We already know how they're going to cast their support, because they've already pledged to do so. And so really, again, it's just kind of a formality, making it official, what we already knew through the primaries. And, and there's a lot of hooting and hollering and all that kind of stuff. And then the big moment is when the state who announces their delegate pledges, and that puts the candidate over the required amount, and then there's a real burst of excitement. And then the fourth day is the nominee's acceptance speech. And so you'll get the presumptive nominee, or now the official nominee, as they go into the election. They'll give their big address, get everybody excited for the stretch run, and then off they go. So let's talk a little bit now about the place of campaigns in American politics. So first off, the media. Television allows candidates to reach the voters. Okay, so nowadays, because we got cameras everywhere, you make a whistle-stop tour in a certain city in America, everybody in America gets to watch. And that's not the way it used to be. The whistle-stop tour was when candidates would get on trains and go from town to town. They wouldn't even get off the train. They would just go to the caboose. There was a little balcony there, and they would give their speech right from the train. And then as soon as they were done, they would clap, and then the candidate would go on to the next station. But think about it. Without TV and radio, That whistle stop tour speech was just for that local community. Nowadays, they still do that. They don't necessarily go on trains anymore. They go on planes, but they'll go to an event, speak to the local people, and act like they're thinking about those local people and they know all their little issues, when in reality they're being prepped on all those issues about 10 minutes before they get there. But everybody gets to watch it on TV. And so that has really, nationalized campaign speeches. When we watch them, we watch these stump speeches, whistle stop tours. These got all kinds of names for when candidates visit small towns or even larger cities on the campaign route. Now, the internet has changed a lot of things, because now you can get to know your candidate a lot more. You can go to their website, you can read their positions, their policies, you can make your contributions with a credit card online. So now you don't even need to leave the house to go vote. You can just say, oh, I supported them economically, and so that's good enough. Candidates themselves can use computers to generate their mailers now. So now not only can you send out, use computers to generate physical mail that you put in the mailboxes, but you can also, do email ads and run ads on big websites like Facebook or Google or any one of these kinds of sites. So all this costs a lot of money, and so campaign budgets is something that we've heard a lot in the last couple of generations, and elections cost a heck of a lot of money. We're talking millions and millions and millions of dollars, and the biggest chunk of that is ads, running TV ads. As we get closer and closer to the election, the airtime on major networks the price goes up and up and up and up. And so candidates are going to try to run ads not only to pump themselves up, but also to attack their opponents. And also they're going to make ads geared to specific populations in different places. And so they're running lots and lots of ads, and that's just TV ads, not to mention print ads and all the other kinds, radio ads. But they're trying to do all this to define an image and get the slogan out there and vaguely define policy, because too much talk about policy is boring. But they're doing this, and it costs a lot of money. So you really need to generate a lot of fundraising to be able to pay for all these ads. But the thing we should always remember about campaign commercials, and we'll watch samples as we go through this stuff, but as a result, it's media is going to be very vague on the issues. And that's both in the interest of the candidate and the actual media outlets. Because remember, talking heads is boring. We have sound bites that are only a few seconds. People can't sit long enough and listen to long explanations of policy. And so we don't ever talk about policy that much. We only talk about the campaign itself, the race. In fact, you'll even hear news channels put it in the terms of the race for the White House. We'll see horse race journalism. All we hear about is the polls and the strategies. And again, it's not a strategy about which policies to pursue. It's a strategy about how you're going to talk about your opponent, how you're going to present yourself, what moves you're going to make, what things you're going to talk about, what things you're not going to talk about. It's amazing how much of the presidential election are these kinds of things and not about policy. Now, when the president becomes president, then it's time to actually do policy, while at the same time maintaining their popularity through these kinds of things that they get elected for. So it's pretty fascinating. It's also frustrating and kind of scary about the role of the media in campaigns and how we've kind of made it into a big reality show or a sporting contest or something like that. Campaigns need lots of people and lots of money again. There's lots of people, and it's bigger than ever to try to run a successful campaign. First and foremost, you got to have a campaign manager, and then sub-managers that are going to help that person to keep the logistics, to keep the schedule. You need advisors to tell you what to say at what points and things like that, and also have an overarching strategy. You got to have a fundraiser who's handling all the money, which can be a big job because there's lots of rules and lots of legality associated with that, as we'll see in a moment. You got to have lawyers. You got to have campaign consultants and media consultants. You got to have a webmaster. You have a print master. You got to have clerical staff, researchers, press secretaries. I mean, you got to have it all to have even a chance at running a successful campaign for president. So because of all these things, you got to raise a ton of money. And over the last couple of generations, people have suggested that the biggest factor that's getting in the way of democracy and a fair campaign is money. So a big issue in campaign is what we call campaign finance. And people have been trying to reform the system to take money out of the equation for many decades now. The first attempt was in 1974 with the Federal Election Campaign Act. And this is happening right after Watergate. This is at kind of the low point of morale in America as Vietnam was ending, Watergate was ending, and basically this, along with something like the War Powers Resolution and a new Budget Act that comes in at this time, Congress is trying to take the powers back in the country and make the presidents weaker. About Watergate, it was also connected to campaign contributions and re-election attempts by Nixon and all that. So we get a new law that's going to try to attempt to control the campaign spending, to try to control these candidates and sitting presidents and their ability to control the war chest for these campaigns. So we get all kinds of new rules. Whenever we get new rules for campaigns, we need some kind of government bureaucracy to enforce those rules. So we have a new bureaucracy called the Federal Election Commission. The main way they're going to try to take money out of the equation is to make it public. This is usually government's solution. Put the power in their own hands instead of letting the private sector handle it. So instead of candidates raising their own money through private channels, now we're going to have federal money or public money that the campaigns can use. And so the Presidential Election Campaign Fund is going to be a big pot of money that can be given to the candidates that they can run their campaigns on. The way we raise this money is through people checking a little box on their tax returns. So you have the ability to say, do you want to contribute such and such amount of your income tax return to the federal presidential election campaign fund? And only about 11% of the population does this because they're the biggest idiots of the crowd, because they're giving people that are already millionaires more money. And I'll explain why you should never do this. They got plenty of money, and you don't have a whole lot of money, so you should hang on to it. And we still have this, but candidates, they have the ability to use those public funds, but if they accept those funds, they're subject to the limits. Because if you use this money, you have to account for every dime spent and how much you're taking and all that. And so because of this, they don't want to be hamstrung by it. And so they say, no, we're not going to take the public funds. We're going to use our own money. So it's all a big waste of time because they don't use it anyways. Now, regardless if you use your own money or the public funds, you must disclose all spending. You have to report all money that's been donated to your personal and presidential campaign, and you must disclose every single dime and how it was spent. The Federal Election Campaign Act also requires that all individual contributions be limited to $1,000, and it would be later expanded. So a certain individual person can donate a maximum of $1,000. And then groups like businesses, unions, and interest groups, if they want to donate money, they have to register with the Federal Election Commission and form a political action committee. And these are still with us today. They are called PACs for short, and they can donate up to $5,000 per candidate. So we put these limits on the amounts that people and groups can contribute so that you put a limit on the amount of money that can be raised and make it fair across the board, then it kind of levels the playing field. It's kind of like the salary cap in the NFL. There are lots of teams who could spend a lot more money on players, but if you put a cap on it, then it levels the playing field and makes everybody be equal in terms of how much they can spend. Another big shoe drops in 2004. and this is called the McCain-Feingold Act. And this is in response to the problem that was left by the 1974 law. There was a big loophole, a big gap in the guard of public money that was being used, or campaign contributions that were being used. So what people were doing to get around the donation limits, remember $1,000 for individuals, $5,000 for PACs, to get around that, contributors began donating money to parties. So it's kind of a back channel route. They would donate to the parties, and then the parties would turn around and funnel the funds to their candidates. And this is what we call soft money. So soft money is now the problem when we get to 2004. So the McCain-Feingold Act, this is John McCain and Russ Feingold, a Republican and a Democrat. So this is a bipartisan bill that had pretty wide support. But what it's going to do now is address this new problem of soft money. So we have bans on soft money to political parties, and it increases the maximum amount for individual contributors to $2,000, and from that point forward, it'll be adjusted for inflation. And then, so for example, in 2016, it's now up to $2,700. The other thing that McCain-Feingold does is ban attack ads or any kind of issue ads within 60 days of the election. So, I guess this was an attempt to take away the negative campaigning out of elections, and it also, was a way to try to keep the money under control. Because remember, ads are the most expensive thing in elections, and if you limit that within 60 days, then you kind of control the money. But notice that it says bar groups from running their own issue ads within 60 days. So this is going to become a big fight because lots of groups want to run their own commercials within 60 days of an election. So in 2010, we get a major lawsuit by Citizens United, which is a group that was producing political films within 60 days of an election. And so they sued the Federal Election Commission, and they won. And so this part of the law was overturned by the Supreme Court 6 years later, and this became a major firestorm. All right, so now with the ban on soft money, we're going to have a new problem that's created by McCain-Feingold. People are not going to settle for having restrictions on their campaign contributions. They're just going to figure out a new place. So now people started using a previously little-known group called the 527 group, which are named for the part of the IRS code that allows them to exist. And what they can do is raise money that are exempt from the donation limits that are set out by both McCain-Feingold and the Federal Election Campaign Act, as long as they don't advocate for a candidate. They can run issue ads all they want, though. Okay, so this allows what would have been soft money contributions now to be diverted as independent expenditures, meaning independent of the official presidential campaign, to this private fundraiser. So now we're going to see an explosion of money being spent and donated to 527 groups. There was really only one election cycle where 527s really mattered, and that was in 2004, which happens to land in between McCain-Feingold and then the big Citizens United case. And the best example is an anti-John Kerry 527 called the Swift Boat Veterans. And what they did was run commercials just over and over and over again, just hammering John Kerry's military service, which is what he kind of packaged his whole presidential campaign on, is that I'm returning to service for my country and so on. But they came out and said, no, he was a terrible soldier, he was un-American, he was sympathetic to the enemy, and blah, blah, blah. He's not who he says he is. They single-handedly destroyed Kerry's campaign and allowed George W. Bush to get reelected that year. So that was the only real heyday of the 527. It was short-lived because they are going to be made obsolete by the next election cycle or soon after that because of another Supreme Court case that goes through called SpeechNow.org versus the FEC. And in this case, the Supreme Court rules that political action committees can now advocate candidates and make unlimited independent expenditures as long as they're not in direct contact with candidates. So in other words, political action committees can raise money all they want and not be subject to the campaign donation limits that were set out in the earlier laws. So this is totally an explosion. This takes the top off the whole game and gives rise to what we now call the super PAC. So here's what you're going to see in a presidential election nowadays. You're going to see the two candidates from each of the major parties. They're going to have their own campaigns, their official public campaigns. They're going to raise their own money, but they're also going to be subject to the donation limits from individuals and groups, and they got to be accountable for all the money that they spend, and so on and so forth. However, alongside those two major campaigns, you are going to see private campaigns ran by the super PACs. And as we now know, they can run issue ads all they want up until the day of the election. They can raise as much money as they want. There's no limitations. They can spend money as they wish. There are no restrictions, as long as they're not in cahoots with the actual candidates. Everybody and their mother knows that they are, but as long as they can't be demonstrable. And so super PACs have really changed the whole ball games now. And we come full circle now, and we see that this is the ultimate example of unintended consequences when government gets its hands on things. So for the last 40 years, we've been trying to figure out a way to take money out of the equation. The government comes up with these rules and regulations, and when it's all said and done, money is now even more powerful than it ever was. It's explosively gone up as far as money being spent on campaigns. And so now, what's happened is money is more influential than ever. So go figure.